This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zakheim, your host, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, Roger sits down with Representative Mike Waltz, who represents Florida's 6th congressional district in the U.S. House of Representatives. They discuss Representative Waltz's new book entitled Hard Truths, Think and Lead Like a Green Beret. They discuss Representative Waltz's time as a Green Beret, bipartisanship in Congress, the importance of national service, the Afghanistan withdrawal, the war in Ukraine, and more.
Congressman Mike Waltz, welcome to the show.
Yeah, hey, thanks. So good to be with you, Roger, and always great to be with anything the Reagan Institute does.
Well, we're grateful for your collaboration and your leadership, friendship for years now, and doing great work on behalf of the people of Florida's 6th. I know they are getting ready and preparing for Hurricane Milton. Before we jump into the essence of the discussion we're going to have today on your new book, Hard Truths, Think and Lead Like a Green Beret. Congratulations on getting this done, published by St. Martin's Press, and one that I know will be great interest. Just give us an update first on, we're recording here on Tuesday, October 8th, and countries watching Hurricane Milton and what's going on in Florida. Obviously, you have experience, unfortunately, dealing with this stuff, and I hope people in your district and Florida at large will come out okay.
Yeah, well, it's just the fact that it's a 1-2 punch from Helene. I mean, they're literally, even in my neighborhoods on the east coast of Florida, much less around the Tampa area and around the Gulf, there are still piles of debris, 2x4, sheetrock, furniture, and we are scrambling to get that removed and taken care of as fast as humanly possible, because every one of those objects can turn into a deadly projectile with 120, 130 mile an hour wind. And then, of course, it's the water. The ground is saturated, so every river, lake, drainage ditch, you name it, can become a flooding event that not only impacts people's homes, but can isolate them. So for our senior citizens, our special needs, and others. But look, the Florida National Guard already has 8,000 soldiers activated, the Coast Guard, FEMA. I mean, sadly, we kind of have this on a bit of an autopilot, but never have we faced one back to back. And it's been a century since one rolled up Tampa Bay proper. And if that happens and people don't evacuate, we could have upwards of 1 million people underwater. So It's a serious event that we are all hands on deck to prepare for.
Well, praying for citizens in Florida and your constituents and come at us okay, and hopefully it won't be that direct hit. 1 million, that would just be unbelievable. I know we were chatting a little while ago. You were in the military with Hurricane Katrina, and you saw the kind of support that was essential. You mentioned the National Guard and the Coast Guard and everybody pre-deployed and ready to go. That's the sort of thing that really will make the difference. I mean, I defer to you on this, but that was my takeaway from watching from Capitol Hill in terms of saving lives and making sure that the damage is not as costly as otherwise would be.
Yeah, it just takes communication. I think we learned a lot of lessons after Katrina in terms of active duty, National Guard, federal entities, and then local and state, kind of who's in charge, where are the priorities, where and how do we surge resources. We've learned a lot. That said, I think some balls were dropped, certainly when it comes to Helene and Western North Carolina. Heck, you've got the 82nd Airborne, 18th Airborne Corps, 2nd Marine Division right down the street. They were raring to go. And I think the state government in North Carolina did not request the support it needed as fast as it should have. And because when people are desperate, they don't care about bureaucratic paperwork or one pot of money or the other pot of money. They're just seeing, trucks and helicopters sitting on a base, not coming to help them.
Yeah, push it through. Unfortunately, Florida probably is a well-oiled machine given its experience with hurricanes. Well, let's pivot from there. No good way to pivot, but it's just psyched to have you here. So much to talk about. Leader on foreign policy and national security and defense matters in the Congress. Just a fantastic set of experiences. from serving in Afghanistan as a special forces officer, as well as time in the Department of Defense, of course, now in the U.S. Congress. Hard truths, right? So you're talking about how the thinking and leading of the Green Beret is kind of gives you these principles and lessons that have shown worthy and valuable in the Congress. First, for our listeners and viewers, talk a little bit about what a Green Beret is. It's people probably know that they're special, but they're different than as kind of colloquially referred to as the door kickers. The SEALs and the like. You have a great way of capturing, in this respect, the book. People should go on Amazon and purchase the book. It's almost memoir form. I mean, in many respects, it is memoir form. Great stories. One about kind of the disciplines that's required as you were seeking your Ranger tab, I thought really was just extraordinary. In that you need to get the support not just from your superiors, but to the people to the left and right of you. All this stuff played into you becoming a Green Beret and, of course, being successful there and now in the Congress. Talk more about that.
Well, it is a unique mindset. I get asked all the time, hey, what's the difference in a Green Beret, Navy SEAL, U.S. Army Ranger? Like we all know that these are elite. They had to go through hellacious selection and assessment processes to get where they are, fantastic physical shape. But kind of what's the difference is, and I think there's a couple ways to describe it that I do in the book. The SEALs and the Rangers tend to be a lot younger. They're the most fit in the world, and they're the best in the world at doing what we did to Osama bin Laden, for example. Finding a bad guy that has been in hiding for years on the other side of the world, going in the dead of the night and putting 2 bullets in the forehead with precision and getting everybody out, right? And that is what the Rangers do phenomenally, and that is certainly what the SEALs do, obviously more kind of maritime and Navy-based at doing that, or putting a mine, a limpet mine on the bottom of a ship, or swimming out of a submarine in the bottom of the Pacific and putting some kind of listening device somewhere. Green Berets are very different in the sense that our training is a lot longer. Mm-hmm. We have to learn local languages. We specialize in certain regions of the world. We really focus on understanding the culture. And you'll take just a few of us and embed us with a village, a militia, a tribe, and we'll train 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 of them to take care of our nation's interests for us. This was really kind of brought out in the movie 12 Strong with the liberation of Afghanistan, where you had just a couple of Green Berets dropped off in the middle of the night. Right. Next thing they know, they've linked up with a warlord. Next thing they know, they're literally riding horseback, charging Taliban lines with the backing of the U.S. Air Force, kicking ass. And literally just a few dozen Green Berets overthrew the entire Taliban dictatorial regime that was partnered with al-Qaeda by, with, and through our local allies. So that is a term you'll hear throughout the book. And really what I do in the book is what are the lessons I learned in those types of situations where I'm not really in charge. Right. You have to do it through influence. You have to do it through what resources, what you bring to bear. But if I can bring a coalition of sometimes kind of murderous, not great people that would assume kill us as they would right. Turn on us as they would the bad guys. If I can bring that kind of coalition together with a series of skill sets, then I can bring a coalition in Congress together, that I can influence a president. And I take us from the valleys of Africa to Air Force One, talking about geopolitics with President Trump, down to Congress, and the banging your head against the wall frustrations of what it takes to get legislation across the line.
And it's slightly comical, right? Because here you are. I mean, you're describing stories dealing with these kind of warlords and the like, and start negotiating, engaging that diplomacy to hand them over to the CIA for interrogation. Don't chop off this guy's head; it's less valuable to us. And these are the lessons you need and tools and skills you're using in the U.S. Congress. And you were the first Green Beret to serve in the U.S. Congress, if I recall correctly, or certainly the most recent one.
Yeah, that's right. From all the research we could do, I was that we could find out there. I was the first Green Beret. There's been a couple of Navy SEALs, so I just tell them it takes 5 of them to equal 1 of us, and then we call it a day. But in all seriousness, we are recruiting more veterans to get back involved in our politics. One of the reasons that I ran in the late 70s, 75% of the House and Senate were vets. They had served together. By the time I ran in 2018, it was down to 15%, record low in our nation's history. I think that explains a lot of our record amount of dysfunction, frankly, because it's not that we agree on all issues. Of course we don't, but we have that commonality of service, that those ethos of leadership, followership, teamwork, discipline. And you know what, if we were all willing to die for that flag together across both sides of the aisle, then we could come together, roll up our sleeves, take the tough votes, and have an objective mindset to move the country forward. Yeah. And Zach, Roger, I called you always called you your dad's name, but real quick, and I also talk about, it's not just in our politics. I think in broader society, we need to get back to national service and make serving great again. And that doesn't have to be in the military. That can be in national parks. That can be in inner city tutoring. But how do we get young folks kind of off the couch, off the phone, and expecting, for example, just educational benefits to fall into their lap? The taxpayer gets something in return, and you get a better citizen in return. And then let's talk incentives like free community college or debt relief after you served this great nation.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that last set of points in terms of national service, and it doesn't have to be limited to service in the military. We're certainly entering a period of time where because it's less than 1% who serve, Americans don't know, can't relate, and as you just noted, it's reflected in the composition of the Congress, and so it makes it even more essential for people like you who have served and understand the sacrifice to be there in the Congress, making the case and educating, and doing the by, with, and through you describe in your book, Hard Truths, with Congressman Mike Waltz. One of the things that I enjoyed in terms of the book, and then more broadly, what you're doing in the Congress is, here you are, you endorsed President Trump early. I mean, one of the first, and that was when you had Governor DeSantis, who was getting a lot of attention, running for office. You're also engaged in a number of bipartisan caucuses, and you talk about some of that in the book, and you and I have talked about that elsewhere, really working across the aisle on some of these issues. Congressman Crow, you've done profiles on the networks where you're not just talking about it, but have actually meaty, engaged work together. You're kind of turning the whole narrative on its head. Certainly you seem to be trying to do that elected officials stay in their partisan corner, and you're out there. You're out there talking on the news, 24-hour news stations, making the case, engaging across the board from policy to politics. So it's hard to kind of pigeonhole you on that. But to me, as I read this book, it's kind of seems to be part of what you're trying to do, the by, with, and through, and you got to be engaging on all fronts. Talk about that bipartisan work, and at the same time being an enthusiastic supporter of President Trump. Not particularly easy.
Yeah, no, it's not easy. Some days I do think the tribes of Afghanistan were easier than the tribes
surprised.
of Congress. But it's not just kind of nugging out bipartisan legislation. Like, for example, I'm working with Senator Mark Kelly right now on a SHIPS Act on opportunity zones for shipbuilding and how do we revitalize that sector. He's the first senator to have gone to the Merchant Marine Academy. And so it's about finding, which we do out in the hinterlands of Afghanistan and Africa as well. It's finding that common interest and focusing on that common interest and prioritizing that over what may divide you. But it's not just the legislation. I took Congressman Crow and 10 other members of Congress to Normandy for the 80th anniversary of D-Day. We jumped out of a perfectly good 81-year-old World War II original aircraft. The parachutes were new, even though everything else was vintage. And we celebrated our forefathers together. And I think America needs to see that that kind of, frankly, leadership from us on both sides of the aisle, that we can come together to celebrate the greatest victory in, I think, world history, which was the defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan by a coalition of allies who didn't always agree by any means. But also, I mean, in the depths of impeachment, With the Mueller investigation, it seemed like everybody in Washington was calling everybody a name, racist, this or that. I sent a note out to all the veterans in Congress and said, meet me at 6:30 a.m. tomorrow at the Vietnam Memorial Wall. This was the day before Memorial Day weekend. Over 42 did. And we met up with the Park Service. We washed the Vietnam Memorial Wall together. And I brought CNN one year. I brought Fox News another year. Like, Americans need to see, besides what the media likes to highlight, which are the train wrecks and the car wrecks and the clickbait on TV. And that's what veterans can do. And those are oftentimes we talk about the hard truths in our meetings, but we nug it out and we move the country forward.
You know, that sort of work, you could talk about civics, but you really need to model it at the end of the day. And those are some really tangible, good examples. At the same time, here you are, you're an elected official from a very red district, and getting elected in this environment today, you got to win the primaries, and you have people that are looking to make sure that you are that rock-ribbed Republican, Trump supporter. Does any of that become difficult to straddle? When you're there reaching across the aisle or taking a stand, how does that play into the politics? Is where I'm going.
Yeah, sure. Look, it's not easy sometimes, for sure, and especially in the heat of an election season. But when you just stick to the substance, for example, I tell the story of the Space Force, right? Everybody was making fun of it. Adam Carell had a Netflix series. It was such a joke. And this is where, President Trump's instincts are often so right, whether it was on Nord Stream 2 and, wait a minute, we're defending Germany, but they're buying Russian oil, or whether it was on, as we talked about, you can't be number one on Earth if you're number two on space. And once he understood what the Chinese and Russians are doing up there and how they're trying to dominate, then he was completely on board with creating a new military branch. He didn't know all the eaches of it.
Sure.
But here's my case in point. He found out that his Air Force secretary was resistant because the Air Force generals were resistant. She wakes up one morning and he fired her by tweet. Kind of a jerk move. I mean, not very nice. But you know what? The generals that were resistant were in our offices the next day, ready to create the Space Force. And now looking back just 4 or 5 years, we see how prescient that was. And I think my point, Roger, is that disruptors are often not nice, whether that is Elon with SpaceX, whether that was Steve Jobs with Apple. And I think Washington, D.C., and frankly, our national security establishment, and certainly a lot of people that are dug into bad old habits in the Pentagon need that disruption. Donald Trump is that disruptor. And when I get people past the personality and we actually talk about the substance, whether it is veterans reform and the VA Mission Act, whether it's Space Force, whether it's the USMCA new NAFTA deal, whether it's the Abraham Accords, the pivot on China that he truly led, which I think is generational tax reform, we can go down the list, then you can get people on board. And as long as we focus on substance and not the eaches of the personality that often comes with how we get that disruptive substance, then we can have conversations.
Absolutely. And Washington's so crazy, and because of the way he goes about his business, it becomes such a binary discussion, like or dislike. But there are definitely, as you get into the meat, whether you're talking about the Space Force, whether you're talking about, as you referenced before, recognizing the threat that the People's Republic of China poses to the United States, those were material and important and significant contributions that have added to our national security and national defense. And I think one of the testaments to that, and so I'm agreeing with here, Congressman Mike Waltz here talking about his book, Hard Truths, is these things have lasted and had staying power even in a Biden administration, whether you're talking about the Space Force or the emphasis on the PLA and the People's Republic of China. Those are the things that have actually are examples of continuity. Let me pivot the discussion here for a second, because an area that I know you are deeply invested in, both in your time serving in the military and then your time in the Congress, has been Afghanistan. And I want to get to some other of the foreign policy and national security issues that you're leading on, but it's so relevant to your work on the book, and it's a story here of tragedy in terms of where we are. I know that throughout the book, and certainly at the end in your dedications, you talk about the families who of Abbey Gate. Who were families of 13 service members who perished in the botched and tragic withdrawal out of Afghanistan. Tell us where you're at, what you and kind of your thinking on Afghanistan, and kind of the work you're doing to really prevent having Afghanistan round two, the sort of environment that gave us 9/11. It is blinking red there in terms of what the Taliban's up to.
Well, I mean, I've been heavily involved in the investigation into the withdrawal, in the House investigation, and of course. Many like to point to the Doha agreement that Mike Pompeo and President Trump entered with the Taliban. And look, that's fair. I'd point out that President Bush also tried to negotiate. Obama tried to negotiate. If you remember the trade for Bo Bergdahl, the 5 Taliban senior terrorists out of Guantanamo for Bergdahl, that was intended to be a confidence building measure to restart Obama's negotiations with the Taliban. As an aside, I tell the story in the book. I had to lead the search for Bo Bergdahl, who absolutely deserted his base. It's in the chapter on loyalty, which is the opposite of loyalty, as compared to many of our interpreters who were so loyal to us and were left behind in the withdrawal debacle. And by the way, I was the first to go, my first ever national television appearance. I was the first to say, time out, America. He was not a hero, Bergdahl. Yeah. He was a traitor. Here's what really happened. And then that subsequently kind of blew up. But the point is, President Trump tried to enter into an agreement, but he made it conditional. And before the end of his term, when his team came to him and said, the Taliban have not lived up to 6 of these 7 conditions, he said, fine, deal's off. Bagram, the main air base, stays. 2,500 of our special operators, our intelligence operatives, and all of the support the Afghan military needs will also stay. So this notion that that the Biden administration was just stuck with it is, I think, is a red herring. It's bogus. And oh, by the way,
it does not.
How about all the other Trump policies, from Keystone XL to the Iran deal to the Paris Climate Accord to the border, that they had no problem carrying out?
It's shocking. It's shocking that even gets play. It makes absolutely no sense. It was an executive agreement at best. It wasn't even they were bound by it because it wasn't an agreement. It is a classic case of just not taking responsibility for a failure. The fact that they talk about it being the greatest logistical accomplishment shows how tin ear they are to that failure. I mean, I completely agree with that critique.
They revised the number since. It went from 100 to over 800 Americans were left behind. Over 150,000 of our interpreters and their families were left behind. And those that don't even qualify for the SIV, but were willing to die with us for the values of our flag, like their commandos and special operators, are being hunted down by the Taliban as we speak. And where does that leave us? Well, ISIS is back. Al-Qaeda is back. They are rebuilding, and they fully intend to hit us again. And as I've said 1,000 times, what happens in Afghanistan does not stay in Afghanistan. We need to begin preparing for what's the plan B. And I am still in touch with the resistance. And so if we get hit again from Afghanistan, like we did from Iraq after Obama, yanked us out of there with no plan, and then you have the emergence of ISIS, what are we going to have to deal with on the ground? We have no bases and no local allies.
One more follow-up, and I know you speak with such passion about the local allies and the people that supported us, because those are exactly the sorts of people that you rely on and build a relationship with as a Green Beret. But as we think about Afghanistan and the point you just made, so many people have been conditioned because of the people in Congress and our presidential candidates. They think, well, doing something about Afghanistan, mitigating that threat will result in a forever war. And that dichotomy is false. There's so much we can do that doesn't require boots on the ground, certainly a direct action where we have, combat casualties, the like that people have been conditioned is the only thing we can do other than the status quo. Take just a minute to explain, hey, because you think about this from a policy level, from a strategy level, from an operational level, that we could actually advance U.S. security without resulting in some sort of endless war in Afghanistan.
Yeah, that's right. We don't need to try to turn Afghanistan into Switzerland. And there were times in the last 20 years that that kind of nation building approach was the approach, and I think we've learned the lessons from that. We have a critical national interest in making sure that we don't have another 9/11 or San Bernardino or Pulse nightclub, and particularly right now with a wide open border. And I don't want to wait until after that happens to then begin having to deal with it over there from a counterterrorism standpoint, from a cyber standpoint, a diplomatic isolation, financial isolation. We can deal with the situation. We can even look at a humanitarian zone in the north that is a zone with kind of like what the Kurds have done in the Middle East for women, for our allies, and for others. But right now, we literally, Roger, have billions in humanitarian aid flowing through the hands of the Taliban. We have China sitting at Bagram, exploiting the critical minerals, and we gave up the only base in the world that's sandwiched between China, Russia, and Iran.
Yeah, the loss of Bagram in itself is just it's the worst kind of negligence, and then you see the Taliban military parades in our assets and our military platforms. It's unbelievable. Let's jump to another area in the world which we have interest. You were talking about our interest in Afghanistan. Ukraine, you write about this in your book. You actually talk about both your visits to Afghanistan as well as how you've addressed it in the Congress, reflecting in your book on your meeting with Zelensky, kind of with a Churchill parallel. And I think we both agree he is a leader who has been courageous in standing up to Putin's aggression, the evil that's coming from Russia in terms of the way they are daily targeting and attacking Ukrainian civilians and innocents. At the same time, you have a strong critique of the Biden administration's handling of the war in Ukraine, and an op-ed that you wrote where the last go around you were just kind of, my words not yours, just fed up with it all and couldn't support it. Which again, you and I have talked about that offline. That was, I know, a difficult decision for you, and certainly those who want to see Ukraine win, wanted to see you supporting that. We're going to be in another situation, Congressman, where Ukraine is going to exhaust the support they've gotten from the United States. At the same time, they've held up, and whether it's in Kursk or elsewhere, actually surprising the Russians and kind of punching above their weight is the way I think about it. Give me your latest thinking on Ukraine and how we address it going forward. You're obviously a close advisor to President Trump. The last thing I'd kind of ask you to fold in is that those members of Congress who actually did vote for it and the Republican side didn't seem to get punished, electorally speaking, in primaries and otherwise. Kind of how do you see the Republican Party viewing this issue now as we enter the election here just about a month out?
Yeah, so to your point, I certainly agree that we needed to do everything possible to prevent Putin from slicing through Ukraine. I do believe him when he says his ultimate goal is to reconstitute the old Soviet Union. Yeah. That means portions of Poland, the Baltics, NATO countries that then would involve U.S. troops, which I absolutely want to avoid. So if they were asking for the beans and bullets to do the fighting themselves, fine. I fully supported that. And they did stop Putin. And I think Zelensky deserves far more credit than Biden, who between lifting sanctions on Nord Stream 2, between comments like only minor incursions, we may not do that much, all of the missteps. And I tell the story in the book. I was there the month before, and the Ukrainians were begging for Harpoon, for Stingers, for weapons to defend themselves, which I'll state for the record, President Trump gave the Javelin missiles and lethal aid, not Obama. And Biden was tapping the brakes on because it was too provocative. It was too escalatory. And even Kamala Harris and her final trip, Zelensky said, give us the sanctions beforehand. Give us the aid beforehand. We might be able to actually stop this war. Here nor there, Zelensky's leadership, with our support, stopped it. My frustration 3 years on is, what does success look like? What is the strategy to achieve it? And when I'm getting asked by my constituents, how much money, how long are we really paying their teachers and first responders when ours aren't getting paid very well? I think those are very fair questions to ask. We did not get good answers. And my biggest frustration is that we haven't enforced the sanctions.
Yeah.
Russia is a gas station with nukes. If we simply flood the world with our clean, available oil and gas, we drive down the price of it, you start putting Putin's economy and his war machine on life support. The analysts have repeatedly told me he won't be able to afford his war machine, but yet we have an LNG ban currently in place. He canceled our Keystone XL pipeline and lifted sanctions on theirs, on Nord Stream 2. So economically, we could be doing far more to end this war.
And the Ukrainians would be the first to push this through. As you know, one of the biggest advocates of the sort of policies you were just articulating is President Zelensky's chief of staff, who effectively functions as like the number two in our pages there. I remember he had a piece in the Wall Street Journal making this case. It is just very hard to wrap your head around the Biden administration policy, where it seems to be an investment in Ukraine not losing, but the notion of winning, giving them the decisive support, does not seem to be something they pursue.
And I ask this in the book as I talk about kind of my evolution on this issue. Is it in America's interest? Are we going to put in the time, the treasure, the resources that we need in the Pacific right now badly? For every Russian off of every inch of Ukraine, including Crimea. Is that achievable? What does that look like? How long is that going to take? I think stop them in the early days, absolutely. But we're at the point now we need to ask those tough questions. And if we say this is going to end up in a negotiated solution, what are the parameters of that, and how do we get to that point? And President Trump is focused on, like, look, let's end this war, not perpetuate it.
Before Inauguration Day. That's what he's going to do, which, admirable goal. How that happens, unclear. One last point, just rejoinder.
Sure.
And certainly you've engaged on this point. To me, as you think about the cost of supporting Ukraine and what that means for our ability to posture ourselves in the Indo-Pacific, I mean, Ukraine is doing work for us in terms of just beating down Russians, their capability, their manpower. I mean, they are, the latest estimates is way over the 300,000 they were talking in terms of Russians injured or killed in action. We got to balance it right. There's certain capabilities that perhaps cross over, but much of it is not crossover. And so it advantages our direct national security, given that Russia is our adversary. That was not just a statement of Biden foreign policy and national security that extends back from the Trump administration and before the Trump administration. There's a value add there. And as you know at the outset, and President Zelensky said this at the Reagan Institute, he is not interested in U.S. forces coming and doing the fighting. He just wants, as you noted, the bullets to fire away.
Roger, at this point, their conventional military has been, as you just pointed out, devastated in many ways. I mean, they are trying to rebuild it. I would argue that the EU and NATO, with an economy the size of the United States and 31 now of the most advanced militaries in the world, can they handle this going forward and take the majority of the burden, as we do need to shift? And this is a broader conversation. I think the munitions we're expending in the Red Sea right now, those missiles and that naval readiness, to somewhat to your point, is what we actually, and those ships are actually literally getting diverted from the Pacific.
That's more relevant. I want to pivot there. And I think from the EU standpoint, they should own the economic side, the support side. and U.S. industry, I think, are better suited to deliver the sort of capability that Ukrainians need in Europe. But let's move on. We've got about 8 minutes left. There's so much to talk about. We're with Congressman Mike Waltz, author of the new book, Hard Truths. Congrats on getting another book out, and really interesting read, learning about the lessons of the Green Beret applied to the U.S. Congress and to Washington. You just referenced the situation in the Middle East. Of course, we're a day after the one-year anniversary of October 7th. Talk about a tragedy and what happens when you take off your eye off the ball when it comes to a threat posed by terrorists, nihilists like Hamas. Israel paid dearly in the United States. The Biden administration came out at the outset, ironclad support. That support was kind of interrupted by the each sidism after October 8th and driving for a ceasefire, perhaps emphasizing that more so than a decisive defeat of Hamas. And then, of course, you think about October 7th, you think about October 8th in America and the anti-Semitism and the anti-Israel kind of rhetoric and actions coming from college campuses and in our cities. Very disheartening to see. Share for a minute here, Congressman, how you're viewing October 7th, a year later, broadly speaking, for the U.S.-Israel relationship, and then some of the points you just mentioned in terms of Houthis in the Red Sea and what it means for our military.
Well, look, I think this administration's Middle East policy, frankly, has just been an utter and complete disaster and failure. I mean, literally in 4 years, we've gone from peace accords, Nobel Prize worthy peace accords being signed on the White House lawn, to the entire region in chaos and in war, and with, for the first time in history, direct attacks, ballistic missiles being fired on Israel directly from Iranian soil, where they've really crossed the line from just using their proxies. To kind of take references from the book, the Iranians, through their Quds Force and through the IRGC, are somewhat masters at the kind of the mindset that Green Berets also bring in terms of operating by, with, and through surrogates and proxies.
They got their ring of fire, which is the worst case of a by, with, and through. Yep. That's
right. And unfortunately, the Biden administration has been focused on the proxies, has been focused on the symptoms of the disease rather than the core disease in and of itself. And again, my frustration is just through the roof, because as long as Iran is flush with cash, they're going to continue to pump weapons and resources. They will rebuild Hezbollah again, as they did after 2006 and the war then. They will rebuild Hamas, and they'll continue to literally shut down global international shipping passing through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal with their proxy, the Houthis. Where do you think the Houthis are getting so many drones, so many anti-ship missiles, and even submersibles? And it's been lost. They even cut undersea cables leading to Europe. Sophisticated capabilities Iran is providing through its kind of Green Beret, I don't want to call them equivalents, but it's the same kind of approach, the IRGC and the Quds Force. So we've got to dry up the cash, one, and then we enter into your point on the anti-Semitism in these groups that are being funded by Iran right here in the United States. What did we do in response to Masa Amini and those nationwide protests? Very little to nothing. What did we do in the Green Movement under Obama when it blew up in Iran in 2009? Very little to nothing. The thing these regimes fear the most, whether it's the Ayatollahs in Tehran or the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing, are its own people. Or its loss of control internally. We were masters at this in the Cold War. Soviet dissidents were household names in Eastern, in the United States, whether they were in Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union. We need that mentality
I couldn't agree
back
more.
again. If we have them looking over their shoulder and worried internally, they've got a lot less energy and resources to go externally. Dry up the cash and support the freedom fighters that are crying for freedom internally at the risk of their lives and their families.
Last question on this one, but it's particularly acute and top of mind for me. It came out of our offices here at the Reagan Institute. We're right across the White House from Lafayette Park. Yesterday was October 7th, and you see protesters and ralliers waving Hezbollah flags and using language that's supportive of Hamas. Here you are. This is a 9/11 generation. I mean, and now we have Americans in front of the White House supporting terrorism, effectively the same sort of language and ideology that you and your service and America sought to fight and defeat after 9/11.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around. It's heartbreaking, and it really is an insult. It's salt in the wound after the disgraceful withdrawal from Afghanistan, it's just hard to swallow. And the veterans community of my generation is really hurting. Nothing on the level of what happened to the Vietnam generation, but it is painful to see nonetheless. And I think, unfortunately, the ideology of terrorism, the war of ideas that's going on, Islamic extremism is still very present. And we have to take a whole of government approach to undermine the credibility of it. And that's why I tell a story of working with an elder here that kept going on and on about his secret weapon. The short version is it wasn't a surface to air missile or some kind of special mine. It was his daughters. And he was smuggling his daughters to India to get educated as a doctor and lawyer. And even though this elder himself was illiterate, he said, this is how we're going to defeat the extremists. We have to defeat their ideology. And he was actually quoting, the thing that the extremists fear the most is a girl with a book, right? And so we have to take that kind of approach. Otherwise, we are going to get hit again. We will suffer another 9/11. And I fear the infiltration that we're seeing right now, funded by the Iranians. We can do the same right back to them.
Absolutely.
We should be pushing Starlink in. And last night, I tell the story of, I asked the head of the Air Force Bomber Command, what does the Chinese Communist Party fear the most? A few more stealth bombers in the Western Pacific, or an uprising inside China?
Right.
And I'm not for anybody to overreact, calling for regime change in Beijing. However, there are minorities like the Uyghurs that is a modern day genocide that is being brutally oppressed. And that should be the front of our engagement with the Chinese Communist Party and supporting them for people that are crying out for freedom. Reagan knew that and did that all over the world. And he often did it with Green Berets and that by, with, and through mentality.
Well, we got to China there at the end, and the by, with, and through approach you just hit on. I mean, after talking about all the other huge challenges before us, we're with Congressman Mike Waltz, author of Hard Truths. And I guess we'll wrap up before we just go to the lightning round. It is remarkable how just in a generation, we have forgotten so much, and those lessons have not been internalized, or at least been forgotten. And we need you continue your work in the Congress to make the case and remind fellow members of Congress, your constituents, and citizens across the country of those lessons. So much more to talk about. We're going to have to wrap it up here. Let's go to the lightning round, where we ask our guests to share their favorite Reagan book, speech, or quote. We'll take all or just one. What do you got for us?
Well, I've got, it was actually the lessons from Reagan that Newt Gingrich used in his Contract of America, called The Making of a Conservative. So that's what I'd put for book. Of course, the speech, A Time for Choosing, because it truly is timeless. It goes to our core values of individual freedom, individual liberty, equal opportunity for all. But again, what Churchill evoked, that, I'd rather die on my feet than live subjugated on my knees. And so only he could deliver the speech the way he did. And then the quote that I love, that I think is so unique about the amazing melting pot that America is, that he made in his speech to Moscow University, that you can move to France, but you can never be French. You can move to China, but never truly be Chinese. But you come to the United States, I would add legally and the right way, then you will absolutely be welcomed as a fellow American. And that is completely unique of any country ever in modern history. And only Reagan could go to Moscow University in the height of the Cold War and deliver it the way he did.
Eloquent and subversive all in one. Congressman Mike Waltz, congrats on the book, Hard Truths. Great to have you here. Look forward to having you back.
All right. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.